just realizing like, oh, we're doing this thing together, and we're in this together, and like we're excited to figure it out together.
That was really refreshing to be in a situation where I didn't feel like I had to pretend like I had all the answers.
There was a sense of like childlike play. Did we all just become best friends?
Hey friends, welcome to another Dreams of Education podcast with me, Kelly Tenkely, and my friend and co-host,
Michelle Baldwin.
Michelle, I have been in some really interesting rooms in the last couple of weeks, and not being running a school, I find myself in places that I'm sitting there like, how did I get here? But I was in a conversation this week that sparked a thought that I wanted to run by you, and just let's converse, because it really gave everybody at the table pause, and it surprised me that it gave everybody at the table pause. But the question, I was sitting with somebody who works in education policy. I was sitting with VCs who are not connected with education at all, just VCs. And then a few of us who have started schools in the micro school kind of adjacent place, both public and private. And the question came from one of the VCs, and they asked, who's the stakeholder? And I was shocked that nobody had an immediate answer, because to me in education, everybody's the stakeholder. It also struck me as kind of a strange question, because obviously in the VC world, in the tech world, in the business world, the stakeholder is usually the customer and the shareholders, who are getting return on investment. So those are the stakeholders. That makes sense in business.
Mm-hmm.
It strikes me that part of the problem that we face in education is that question, and whether or not it's getting asked explicitly or it's just kind of this underlying the way things work. I think not understanding really who the stakeholder is in education concisely is kind of a huge problem.
I would heartily agree.
It creates the conditions that we're answering the wrong questions because we're starting in the wrong places. All of us had different answers. I mean, my first just throw out answer was literally everyone is a stakeholder, which is part of the issue, because everybody needs to benefit from education in one way or another, right? We all go through it. We all benefit from it in society. So there's all these kind of pieces. And then as the conversation went, I was like, if you're asking me as a school leader who my stakeholder is, it's the students. And somebody else said, well, the parents. Another micro school leader started with parents. And I was like, that is not my stakeholder. That's not my primary stakeholder who I'm concerned with. It's the kids, and then parents secondarily, and then, community. But truly everybody is a stakeholder. For me, it just always starts with the kids. But I wonder what that, I know I just said so many words, but I wonder what that makes you think of.
I think it's very indicative of how people view education for those people who are outside of education. That again, there's often a tendency, and especially in our society, to look to the business model for everything. And so, of course, who's the stakeholder? Who's going to benefit from this? Well, duh. I mean, it's the kids. And that's, to us, that's the most important. Again, I know that we have parents who are very involved in their children's education, and I'm glad for that. But when it comes down to it, 50 years from now, I'm hoping that student, that child that is now a grown-up, can look back and say, I really appreciated this from my teachers. I really appreciated the opportunities, the learning experiences that we had, because they were rich, and I gained so much more than just the particular topic or skill that we were trying to learn. But it taught me something about life. It taught me something about myself, all of those things. I can say that about some of my teachers for sure.
Absolutely.
And those things directly benefited me. Indirectly, my parents, my community members, whatever. Indirectly, the students I teach today.
Yeah.
But it's still a personal relationship that education is going, it's my education. It's not my parents' education.
Yeah.
It's not my
And
neighbor's education.
I think it's hard to think of kids as stakeholders because we don't typically give them voice in those spaces or in those ways, because we think in terms of like transaction, that we don't get return on that investment for a while, right? Like it takes a lot of time to see how that's going to shake out. And in our society, we want like the immediate results as quick as we can get them. We want proof that it's working, which I think is why we put so many artificial constraints in place as far as like grades and testing, and because we want to prove that there's return on investment. And it makes me just, I mean, obviously we've had enough of these conversations. People will know it makes us crazy, but it really is disheartening that we've created these so many artificialities based on thinking our stakeholders are someone that maybe they're not.
Well, and even thinking about the term return on investment, every human is worth investment, right? And I'm not going to put a dollar
sure
amount.
Think so.
I mean, and if you don't think so, we've got some problems, right? But if every human is worth investing your time, your energy, your money, your hopes, I mean, all of those things, human beings are worth that. And you cannot put a monetary value on that. And we try to do that. And I think, again, we go back to that kind of that it's like our society for sure worships the business model to an unhealthy degree. And we don't need to have the conversation today whether capitalism is good or bad. We both have our own feelings about that, and that's not really the point of this podcast. But when you look at it through a capitalistic lens, education is not a good investment.
Well, I would argue it's a great investment.
I agree with that.
However, I think that looking at it in that way, it's not an efficient investment.
Exactly.
And we said that similarly last week. Like, it's just not efficient. Learning is not efficient. Humans are not efficient. I think it's worthwhile. I think it's enormously worth investing in. But when we think about it in terms of like the business mindset of, I need to see, enough returns that investment feels worth it. Well, that's going to be too long of a game for most who are thinking in those terms. Right. Are going to want to play.
And that's exactly what I meant by what I said. If you're looking at it only through a capitalist type of lens, it doesn't make sense. You're not getting that return quickly enough. It's expensive. There's no efficiency. However, we're talking again about humans.
Yes. And not only is there no efficiency, but it's such a complex interplay of systems that are happening when you look at educating all of society, because you're not just looking at their brain and the academics and can they pass a test, because what underlies the ability to do that are so many other interconnected processes and systems that impact the ability to do that. And so it puts education in this really unfair position, because we look at one metric to measure it and to say, is it working or not? And, how many times do we hear education is failing? It's a failing system. It's, all these things. It's not a fair statement because we're not considering all of the systems at play when you're educating a child.
Right. That's, you and I have talked about, I've picked up the book, What Works May Hurt, The Side Effects in Education by Yang Zhao. And first of all, met him quite a few years ago, and just really enjoyed having conversations about philosophies in education and just, hearing about his background. But also to say that, things like No Child Left Behind or Race to the Top or any of the kind of initiatives that we've had as a society to, hey, let's try this with school. Well, it became very measurement heavy, very test heavy, very test prep heavy. And the joy of learning really became something else. And what he writes in that book, and he's also, done many talks, several TED Talks, but also has explained things about what he wrote in that book. And we'll put that in the notes for the podcast too. Yeah. But really how are unintended results of what we did. We thought this particular type of testing was really going to help us learn why kids weren't learning, and we were going to fix it. And what ended up happening, just an example, when we focused on reading in a way that was not organic or joyful, or even thinking through how children develop to learn to read, and we made it into this scientific thing, we removed all of the joy of learning. We stopped even giving kids books to read just for fun. And what that result was, we don't have better readers.
Right.
And we have more people who don't like to read. They feel like it's something that is painful.
And will never do it again outside of school. I mean, the numbers are shocking.
They are. And you and I've talked also about, kids who struggle to read and are still pass through school and get to, 16, 17, 18 years old and are still struggling to read. And what do? They put them into remedial programs that just try harder. And again, those kids are,
That boggles my mind, because if they've gotten to be 16, 17 and they're still not reading, that means they've been through several iterations of remedial programs that are still not working. I think all the time about our students, because we didn't have these kind of artificial constraints of you need to be reading by this day or by this age or whatever. A lot of times if we saw that a kid was not picking up on that, on the reading skills, that cognitive processes were underlying that may have needed to be addressed before it was even possible for them to read. And I'm, again, thinking about kids who have been through enough remedial programs that they get to 16, 17, still not reading. There's likely other factors at play, whether it be, like you said, nutrition. Do I have enough for my brain to operate optimally? Those cognitive processes that are underlying, does my brain have the ability to do that? Have I learned, or do I have the visual processing necessary to hold a picture in my mind of what the story is telling me? Like all of these pieces, am I getting enough sleep? Do I have trauma in my background? Like there's so much. And that's what I mean by like, there's all these systems at play that to just say, their score is XYZ and so we're a failing system is not a fair metric. And again, when you're not paying attention to your stakeholder being the student first, you're making decisions based on external outward metrics and proving that you can change it without addressing what the underlying thing is. And that's really easy to do when you're thinking that your stakeholder is the district or is the Department of Ed or is
taxpayer,
the foundation, the taxpayer, whoever else. And depending on who you ask, everybody had a different answer. Or if you even think it's the parents, right? I think if you don't start with thinking of the kids being the stakeholders that ultimately you're responsible to, you make all kinds of decisions that don't necessarily make sense for the kids.
Right. Well, and let's take a step back again, especially if someone has not heard the previous episodes of our podcast, to talk about cognitive processes or cognitive skills. And some children come to school able and ready to learn because of something completely outside of their control. Other students don't have that. When we look at the whys behind it, again, it could be poverty, it could be not enough food, it could be not having a safe adult around, lots of different reasons. And again, everything
trauma
outside.
Response.
Absolutely.
We saw those cognitive processes be so enormously impacted by stress and anxiety.
Right.
Where as soon as we got the stress and anxiety worked out, suddenly all the cognitive processes were like fine and they could do everything.
Exactly.
So there's so much that goes into that.
And those kids often get written off in some schools as, well, they're just not smart, or they don't have the ability to learn. And that is so...
Or they're not applying themselves.
Right.
Is the one that makes me... Because that one is so ingrained in us.
They don't want to try.
They're just not trying. They're not applying themselves. They're being lazy. And as a society, we've been conditioned to see people that way. We've had parents that are even like, well, they just won't try. He just won't do anything. And then we find out what's actually going on. And, it's like, oh, there was a bigger story happening here.
Right. But what we also learned is to test kids to find out what the underlying condition might be is often very expensive. And so parents
Yes.
don't always have the means to do that kind of testing. If schools or other health organizations are not able to provide that, we again are just perpetuating this set of kids who we've got the haves and the have-nots again. And if there is a leaky memory, for example, we call it that, even though that's not the technical term. If we know that a child has a leaky memory, that things are just not sticking the way that it should, and we have been able to discover this through testing, and we know that there's cognitive training that can help, those things are not being provided as a default in most schools.
Nor are teachers, none of my teaching programs taught me any of those.
Right.
How to approach that, right? I knew that I knew these things existed, the measurements for these things, but there was no and here's what you do when you find that there's a deficit here or there's a problem here, which I think is an enormous hole in at least the American teacher prep programs. So I look at these kids and it's like we're putting so much pressure on a system, on teachers, on all of these pieces, but then even something that seems kind of silly, like not being clear who the stakeholder is, I think is impacting so many decisions and so much of how education is happening.
Right. And that's when we look at where the funding goes. Like, we talked last week in the professional development, how many schools and school districts spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on professional development, and they do it for a year and then they move on to something else. And I'm like, okay, what if instead of doing these things, we really looked at what truly makes a difference for the student, start with the student first, and then plan backwards from there. Where are we actually using our money in a way, our funding, our budget in a way that directly benefits students? Or is it somewhere in the middle? And now we've got all of this bloat that looks like excess. And well, I guess we didn't really need that. Well, then the schools get less funding. And it's this kind of vicious cycle where, again, if we broke it down and just looked at the basic essential needs for each kid. One of my friends, Corey Plow, was a classroom teacher, and he said, I can guarantee that my students' test results will be higher on the days when I give them snacks. And I'm like, that's really interesting. And he was like, he goes, it's a given. He goes, I've proven it. I've, basically done all of the noting of here's when it happens, here's when it does. That stat alone makes me really worry that is one level of thing that we could do for kids. And right now, how many states are saying, yes, we're absolutely funding at least 2 meals a day every day for kids. Yep. And some states are taking that away. And I look to say, okay, where is your justification for, well, it's a parent's responsibility. Okay, great. Even if that is your justification, that child has no control in that place. So if I know making sure that they have a good quality hot lunch helps them to learn, or they come to school and they have a little breakfast and that helps them to learn, why would I not want to provide that for every single kid regardless?
Well, and I think, again, we take too short of views on things. So it's easy to say, well, we just don't have the money to do that in every state for every kid, and it's just going to be too expensive. What we're not doing is taking the long view of we are preparing the citizens for our community and our world that are going to carry into all of this matters to us because we need a educated citizenship that can put back into the community. Does none of us any good to not have that. That impacts all of us negatively. So it's like, take the longer view, because the longer view is they don't have the nutrition they need. Okay, well, what does that mean? That means that they're probably not going to perform well academically because they don't have the necessary resources for their brains to function optimally. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, that means they'll probably drop out. Well, what does that mean? That means that we're probably going to have to support them in other ways in the society later on because they don't have the opportunities. So it's like we're just pushing the problems downstream and wondering, like, we're the ones throwing the bodies in, right? What's that metaphor where somebody downstream keeps pulling out bodies, and somebody comes along and says, why are you pulling out the bodies? And because they're going to drown, but he's getting tired. And he's like, well, who's putting them in to begin with? And it's like, well, in the education system, we're actually the ones chucking them in by some of these decisions that we're making. And then we're like, well, that'll be somebody else's problem down the way. But that's all of our problem down the way. It's not, it impacts every single one of us. So it's like, again, education is tricky because it does have arms and threads into every single other part of our society and is connected to literally everything else. And so it's like, why are we not better framing the problem that we're solving? And part of that is like, who is the stakeholder? How do we start there?
Are we asking the right questions? Are we looking at the wrong problems? Are we trying to solve something that doesn't directly affect the kids first?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I also think, again, and I know I've said this before, there is some contempt for children on the part of a lot of different adults. And with those folks set aside, the people who really do care about kids are often the ones who are in the classrooms and in the buildings to make sure that we give them agency to meet the needs of each individual kid. A lot of that depends on, well, what's my class size? What's my class load? All of those things we keep kind of shoving on to teachers, right?
And what constraints do I have to meet, right? Because if there's artificial constraints of they have to look like this on this day,
right,
have to be reading by this day, well, now how do I do that? Well, here's a curriculum to do that. Well, the curriculum stakeholder is not the student. The curriculum stakeholder is the district or the leader who's purchasing the curriculum. And their goal is to get kids to pass the test. It's not for kids to actually learn. And so it's like, yeah, the autonomy, I think, is really important. We saw that firsthand at Anastasis. Like, what does it look like to have full autonomy over what we're doing? We had it at my level, the principal leadership level, where it was like we could make the decisions that we wanted. You all had it within your classrooms. The students had it. So it was like at every level, we had the ability, but it all started, and we've said this over and over, but it all started with kids and getting to know kids, because a lot of what we discovered was the academics is almost the last layer. It is. I mean, it like the hierarchy of needs show us it's the last layer, right? We have to be safe. We have to be fed. We have to have our base needs met. We need to be socially and emotionally regulated. Then the learning can happen. But in most schools, when we're not starting with the kids, it's really easy to go straight to the academics and assume that all the other needs are being met by some methodology.
Right. You can take a look at almost any school board and school board meeting across the country. Very rarely do they involve students as a member of a school board. Very rarely are students the ones other than when they're being recognized and given an award.
Sure.
I've been to many, many school board meetings in my lifetime, and often they're not the ones who are allowed to speak when there's a concern. It's usually they have to have a parent or another adult who goes to speak for them. And
advocating on their behalf. Yeah.
And, a lot of adults would make the excuse, well, they don't know what's important, so they can't. And I'm like, again, I think that people just maybe have either forgotten what it's like to be a kid, or they only remember, the silliness or or when they were trying to push off from school and not want to do the things. But we have experienced a lot of kids who are very, I don't want to say the word serious, but very invested in their own learning, and they know what they want.
And articulate,
yes.
articulate when it's not working, able to advocate for themselves, even if they don't know exactly what the solution is, they can advocate enough to say what's currently happening isn't the thing. Yeah, I don't think we give kids enough voice in that way, certainly. In most places, school is done to them.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
They don't have a lot of voice or choice in any of it.
I saw a post today and I wish that I had saved it, but it was, again, another study about kids learning. And in the article that was posted, it was, oh yeah, we talked to the math teachers and it was about math. We talked to the math teachers and we talked to the principals and we talked to the parents and the school board members. And here's what we discovered. And somebody else commented, did anybody think to ask about the kids? And nobody had. And again, we kind of go back to the same vicious cycle of, as you said before, school is being done to kids. And I remember going to high school and talking with the students that they had chosen to speak for the school. And they were all, straight A students. They were in honors classes and AP classes and things. And when I suggested that school might look a little different and that I would also ask the kids what they should learn, they instantly said, oh, no, you couldn't do that. And I was like, well, why? And so these were, are seniors in high school who've already learned to play the game and they think the game is what's important because they're good at it.
I was going to say, and they found success in the game.
Right.
Which is why they're in this room to begin with.
Yeah. And that's what they think it's supposed to be. And I said, well, so does that mean that if you're interested in something, you shouldn't learn about it? And they couldn't really answer that question because they couldn't separate learning from the game of school.
Yes.
That, again, I knew that was the case, but it was really, I kind of had hoped to hear something different because I knew where that school was trying to go. And I was like, well, yeah, if your little brother only wants to talk about baseball, I'm like, I could teach your little brother to read. I could teach math. I could teach physics. I could teach history. I could teach music. I mean, there are all of these things just by tapping into that one little interest. It wouldn't just be baseball, but stop and think about, how I grabbed your little brother's interest. And it did not compute for her because that's not how school is set up for kids to learn.
Well, and a lot of those kids you'll hear say, well, I'll be able to do that when after school or when I'm, that's a solve for a different day. When I'm in the real college, when I'm in the real world. And, sweet babies just don't have enough hindsight to be able to know that day never comes because we've oriented our world this way. And when you've been so conditioned by that system for that long, it's really hard to unthink that system. And so you enter the workforce with that same mindset and you feel trapped in so many areas of life, thinking that, well, someday, and then you push it out to retirement. Well, when I'm retired, that's when I'll get back to those things I'm interested in. And the day never comes because we're constantly chasing this like false narrative that there's something out there that's going to fulfill us. And it's not the thing we're interested in. I mean, it's just a little bit absurd.
It reminds me of we always talk about how we like to have kids have an entrepreneurial spirit. But what that reminds me is that there are a lot of people who consider themselves entrepreneurs who are out there and they're like, oh, this is a niche. I'm going to go. And they don't actually speak with anyone who is a stakeholder. They just create something and say, here, you need this. And they and some people are like, oh, I need this. Oh, thank you. And others are like, why would you think I needed this?
Yeah.
That doesn't fit any need I have. And that happens outside of education as well. So it's kind of that same model of someone else has decided for kids, this is what you need, and you must do all of these things. And if you and I have both been on curriculum writing teams before, and you know what it's like when you're in those curriculum teams, the adults can't always agree because everybody has their pet or their passion project, right? And that's so important. They have to learn this.
Or the thing that lit me up in school is the thing that's going to light everybody up in school. And you're like, well, no, but it probably will somebody, but not everybody, right?
And that's again, going back to, yes, there are things that we don't know. And there are some fundamental things that everybody should probably learn. We have at least been able to agree on that. But when you look at, again, most curriculum products are miles wide and maybe a centimeter deep. And
Yep.
we try to cover too much instead of asking the stakeholders, if I need to concentrate on teaching you how to find the theme in this particular text, maybe I choose different texts. Maybe I ask the kids to choose the text and then report back to me, rather than we're all going to do exactly the same thing and you're going to do the way I ask you to do it.
Or what we loved was like, let's start with an interesting enough question that we can follow in all sorts of different directions. And suddenly you see that what we're learning in math has implications for what we're doing over here as part of the inquiry. Like all of it now has context and meaning, rather than we're doing it because someday you're going to need to know this, or, and the magical someday never comes. I don't know. Like,
or they don't recognize
there are things that I learned.
Yeah.
Yes, but I feel like there were a lot of things I learned that I was tested on in school that it's like, well, someday you're going to be glad you know this. And a lot of, like, truthfully, a lot of those things, no, it's just taking up head. I didn't need to know that. There wasn't any purpose to that, right? But more importantly was those teachers who taught me how to engage the world from a place of curiosity and interest, and then how to connect it with the things I already understood and seek out people or opportunities that could help me learn the next thing. I think about, we're both kind of geeking out right now with Carlo Rovelli's book or books. And in reading these books on quantum physics, and you're like, oh, the thing that we thought is not actually how this works, but we were taught in school that this is the only way it works and you have to memorize it because this is the way the world works. And I wonder how often we're like completely shutting down even the opportunity to grow and understand the world in new ways because we train kids that it's already been figured out and it's your job just to know what it is,
memorize
rather
it,
than saying the world is endlessly interesting and your curiosity is going to like take you in all kinds of places, and we can like make all these connections and we can understand things that we don't understand today, and we can keep innovating and growing and like endlessly fascinating. And we kind of teach the opposite of that by the way we do school.
Well, I think kind of what you said back before about it's how it's framed. And I think like you'd said, your teacher had said, you're going to need to know this someday and you're going to be glad that you did, rather than sometimes we learn things because it helps our brain to make connections to new things, or it helps our brain to grow in different developmental ways. So framing it that way isn't that this particular fact or this particular skill isn't as important long term as the fact that it helps your brain to explore and to grow. And those are the things I think that we've done at Anastasis really well. And to be able to say to kids, yeah, you might never need this geometric function ever again in your life. Maybe you will, and you're using Excel and it helps you figure it out by yourself, right?
Right.
All of those kind of things that, yes, maybe it's not something you need to memorize. What you're doing right now helps your brain to learn something new in a different way. And each one of you in this classroom is experiencing it differently. And my job is to help you to see if you can figure out what it means, rather than memorize this because you're going to need to know it again someday, or you need to know it for a test, or you'll be happy when you're baking someday, you'll know how to do this. I mean, or building something.
I think all the time of the number of skills that we learned in school that were exclusively for school. What comes to mind is like the 5-paragraph essay that never in my life has anybody outside of an education system asked me to write a 5-paragraph essay. Is it necessary to understand how to write compelling, interesting writing that has beginning, middle, end? Is it, like we can make that argument, but a 5-paragraph essay was so drilled in for so many years. And it's one of those things that it's like, that was done. I learned that for school so I could be successful at school. And I think about how many of the, you talked about reading being reduced down to snippets of a book instead of something like whole and interesting and compelling that kids could get into. And I think about the reason that happens. And it's because, well, we got to make sure that they can identify theme and character and voice and all these things. The main idea. And we do that in such a way that it's easy to measure and test on the back end. So again, the stakeholder is whoever cares about that outcome. It's not the student who's like, I don't care about this. This doesn't matter to me. This isn't interesting. And how hard is that skill to learn when you have zero interest in what's even happening in that section that you're supposed to comprehend and report back what it means? Much more compelling is like when a kid, how many of our kids, read Harry Potter or Lemony Snicket series and just like absolutely fell in love with reading. And then suddenly it was contagious and the whole class was reading and discussing and into this. None of it was teacher directed outside of us, making sure they had access to those books. But they were getting the main theme and they were getting character development and they were, all of the things. And then they were reenacting it on the playground. And I think about what would have happened if we had just taken a paragraph out of Harry Potter, given it to them and said, tell me the main idea in this paragraph, what that would have done to, none of them would have wanted to read the book.
Right. It reminds me of a lot of reading textbooks have an excerpt from two different texts. And then you're supposed to read each and then make comparisons or, all of those things. Or, what connections do you make? Well, you didn't give them time enough to actually live in the book, right? So now I'm thinking, okay, well, there was one class where I didn't do a whole class book all of the time, but with certain classes, I knew that I could do that and it would meet the needs of a lot of different kids. So one year we read Where the Mountain Meets the Moon. And I remember the kids really got into it and some of them loved it. They loved the story. Some liked the characters, some liked the dragons. For different reasons, the kids were interested in it. Right. And and
you had some that like the cultural significance of that book.
They just loved
really
it.
Compelling. Yeah.
So it was interesting because, again, I was reading it with them. We were talking about it all the time. They were, drawing and taking notes in their own style. That reminded me, like note taking is one of those things that we learn specifically for school that we teach it a certain structure, and that doesn't always work for every kid. But I digress.
Right.
With that particular book, my favorite part of learning wasn't, summarize what you read today, was the kids sitting in a circle. And again, they were usually drawing as they were listening to each other read or to me read. And then they would say, hey, you know what this reminds me of? And I'm like, because that's what you want them to do, right? They're making connections. And they were able to do that on their own because there wasn't anything that I had assigned them to do that was artificial, right? It wasn't like compare and contrast.
We're taking away from the moment where that connection would happen in their brain, right? If they're so focused in on the task you've given them, they don't have space to go, I have a connection here. I noticed, or I wonder, all of those pieces that make it interesting and keep us reading as adults,
right?
Where it's like, before we turned the camera on, we both were talking about things that we were reading and connections we were making between the different things and the conversations that we were having and how it was impacting. And that's what you want out of it, is that it's all connected and that this piece is not just this thing that you're reading is not just for the sake of you're reading it because it's a good book. It also is connecting to other things in your life that you care about that are helping you think about it in new ways.
Well, in testing, when you look at how standardized testing, how it's used in schools, what it actually measures, is it measuring the important things? Of course not, because those can't be measured. However, those kids who really are deep thinkers, who take their time and they really kind of chew on ideas, they often are not great test takers. What does that say to them as the actual stakeholder when they continue to get this information that you're just not really a great student, but they know that they're thinking all of the time. And now they equate test taking with success rather than that deep thinking and methodical process that they have. I have, I gave birth to a couple of those kids, but also I would love for kids to be able to see that the things that they're interested in, that the time that they're given to think and really mull something over, especially as you'd mentioned earlier, we're in a world that constantly rewards the quick, and deliver it now, get it. Okay, great. Now we've got it. And we don't take that time to really just kind of sit back and think. One of my favorite accounts to follow is a retired teacher. And she has something called sit and stare time, where she gets up in the morning and she has her coffee or her tea and she sits and she just stares. She says, I don't look at my phone. I don't read. I just sit and stare. And a lot, she used to get comments. People were like,
love that.
And I thought, you know what? For me, that I do that in different times of my day. Mm-hmm. But I'm forcing myself to do it because that's when my brain really gets engaged and starts thinking of different things.
How many of us, all the ideas come in the shower, right? It's because we're not being consistently like bombarded by everything else, right? The to-do lists and all the pieces.
I think Carlo Rovelli says that in White Holes. It might be another book that I read, but I think he does. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's important. Again, I think we put so many artificial timelines on learning. Learning has no timeline. Like that's something we did to learning. And I think it's a disservice that not only have we put timelines on learning, but we've also then said to be a productive citizen, you must do it in these ways and in these times, with ignoring, number one, developmental processes of individual humans, forgetting that we are human and that we are organic and things grow and change and develop in their own unique ways for each of us. And then, like we said earlier, not taking into account the social emotional health of a student, not taking into account what trauma they may have incurred that needs to be maybe addressed before they have the ability to do what we're asking them to do. It doesn't take into account all of these vital things that we know are fundamental for the brain to be able to learn and to grow in the ways that we're expecting it to in schools. Even, I know SEL and social emotional learning has been co-opted by folks who have all kinds of opinions on it.
And
agendas. What upsets me about the way that social emotional learning is so often done in schools, it's bolted on as an afterthought or as an extra program, rather than it's everything that we actually, when I think about what we did at Anastasis, we talked so much about relationship, but what was really happening was socially and emotionally, we were working with kids so that the rest could be true. So much of what we were doing was actually social emotional work, not academic work.
It was still academic, but yes.
It was, but it wasn't starting.
Right.
It wasn't that we were starting there. It was starting by building relationship, getting to know kids. During detox week, it was helping them understand who they are. It was helping us understand who they are. It was knowing who had anxiety and giving them the tools to help them, when they were in an anxious or stressed out, or even recognizing when that was happening. It was helping them name emotions so that they could get better at understanding how they were reacting to something or why they were shutting down or all of those pieces. But it was happening with the learning or with the academics. It wasn't, neither the academics or the social emotional learning wasn't happening in isolation. I think the problem is we think of everything, again, in very consumeristic terms, where we're thinking academics is this and we have to do it here. And then we have this social emotional product and that happens over here, rather than seeing it more as a natural, organic, it all is connected. It's all, have I had enough to eat is going to impact how I feel emotionally. And we know this as adults. We literally have memes about being hangry, right? We're like, duh.
It's an entire ad campaign about it.
There's an entire ad
campaign. So, it's something that you bring up. So again, a lot of times education, traditionally has been, let's compartmentalize everything down to its very basic point, and then we'll keep it siloed.
Yeah.
Again, math is its own thing. Science is its own thing. English and writing,
literacy,
all of those things, right? And we know that that isn't how learning actually happens, nor can you completely discount that they're connected in so many different ways. When you only do art during art, and you only do math during math, and you only do music during music,
and only address the social emotional aspect of a child during SEL time.
Right.
Yeah.
Instead of looking at everything weaves together in a really beautiful and marvelous way. And we look at it that way, and we approach things with wonder. And then kids really start to see the connections a lot more easily. So what happened in that example I shared about reading Where the Mountain Meets the Moon was only happening because we weren't doing reading at that time. It was talking about a lot of different things, including how we express ourselves, how does culture change our outlook on this book compared to other things we've read. All of those things were very natural for that class because it was something that we were doing as a practice. I didn't say, okay, we're only concentrating on reading, so don't draw, because that's not reading. Right? All of those things, and including social emotional learning, which if we only use the acronym and you hear people with an agenda talk about how it's wasting time during the school day when kids need to be learning. Well, social emotional learning is learning. Right? Yes. And if I know, oh, wow, my stomach's starting to hurt and my heart is racing really hard and fast, I'm stressed out about something. And that means I need to remove myself from a situation because I'm probably upset. I need to take a couple of breaths. And then I might think about speaking. When we teach that to kids, that is helping them learn how to do life in a very responsible, but also self-reflective way. And they start to learn more about themselves. When we hear back from high schools that, wow, your kids come in and they know how to advocate for themselves, they really know how they are as a learner. Yeah, because we spent years helping them.
They'll also say, like, they're some of the most reflective, thoughtful people. And it's like, well, yeah, because that was what we've been doing the last 8 years.
Exactly.
9 years.
And it wasn't just because I know a lot of schools look at social emotional learning and they equate that just to character. So then they do like the whole character counts curriculum. Like, no, that is doing too. And assuming kids are just consumers rather than, hey, let's take stock of who we are and figure out this is how I react in a situation.
And back to your reading, I mean, even as we were reading books, we would pause and talk about, what is this character experiencing right now? When have you felt that way? What do it's again, making the connection back to who they are and how they experience the world, and helping them see that one of the things that's really interesting about books is it helps us reflect on how we experience the world and how others might experience the world.
Mirrors, doors, and sliding.
Yes. And all of that is social emotional learning. And so to say that reading is different than SEL is like absurd to me. To say that math is different than SEL seems absurd to me because it's like, well, it's all learning, and learning is life. I mean, how many times do we say to kids, learning is life? Like all of life this is what we're doing here. We're learning.
It also really helped kids become a lot more empathetic. And I say empathetic instead of empathic for a reason. It doesn't necessarily mean you always have to sympathize with someone else. But if you can read the room, that is a huge skill. And that empathy is part of that. But also to know that, oh, somebody walked in today and they're already looking very down. And our kids would instantly go up and say, hey, how can I help? Are you okay?
Yes. I was going to say the awareness, which this was on our report card, right?
Right.
Report card in quotes. Awareness is a skill that we wanted kids to have, that they're aware of their surroundings, they're aware of other people, that awareness was important. Compassion was also on our reports because we wanted kids to be compassionate. Both of those examples that you just gave happened because we focused on how do we make sure that kids are aware of what's happening in the environment? How do we help them be compassionate individuals Well, all of that was coming not because we had a SEL curriculum, but because we were approaching learning through as whole people, which included the social and the emotional.
And that didn't happen just within the school building. It happened when we went on field trips and service learning trips. All of that's still incorporated as part of how we do school. This is who we are as Anastasis people. We care about others. We know enough to stop, take a breath, and look around us to see what's the situation that's happening in front of me right now. And again, they're children and we're adults, we're humans. We weren't always perfect at that, but we
make mistakes. Yeah.
We use those as really great tools to learn more about, oh yeah, I realized I just got really frustrated with you guys and that's about me. That wasn't really about you. I apologize for that. I probably need to go get a snack.
Was in the repair.
Right?
Yep.
Anybody else want to get a snack right now? Because it's probably time for that. I mean, it's
probably time. Yeah.
All of these things we can think about that are human needs.
I was going to say a lot of what they learned as in the social emotional realm came from the modeling of us saying, I came in really feeling anxious today and I don't even really know why, but this is how it feels in my body, and we would say that to the kids during metanoia and then talk. Anybody else ever woken up like, I don't know if it's the wrong side of the bed or that it's cloudy outside or what's going on. And you start this dialogue of like, oh yeah, that happens in my world too, Suddenly we're not alone. We're in a community where we've all had similar experiences. We can see each other differently. We can be aware of each other differently and aware of ourselves differently because now we've had that experience where it's like, oh yeah, I have, we have the pause where we can actually reflect and go, yeah, I have felt like that before. I do know that feeling. But again, it wasn't something that was bolted on separately as another product that we added to our school. It was looking at our stakeholders as whole people, stakeholders being kids, as whole people and saying, what do these whole people need? What are the conditions that they need that will enable them to learn today? Well, it's going to be food. It's going to be that if we're aware of trauma that has happened, that we're taking that into account. It's that we, how to cultivate those learning conditions so that they can show up better prepared for the quote unquote academics.
Well, and again, they knew that they had people who cared for them at the school. They knew that if they needed a break or something that was a little bit different than maybe what you would see in a traditional model, they knew that they could get permission for that. Not all kids learned that right away. It was something that over time they started to experience and to see that it wasn't just words, that it was action.
And it got easier over time because they saw other students experiencing it with us.
Yeah.
And then it was easier to trust, right? Sometimes adults in schools or homes say things, but then that's not how it actually plays out. And so I think for some, they needed to see. I saw somebody else do this and it seems to be true. So now I'm going to trust it. It got easier over time because that was just the culture that got built.
Well, and it even carried over into how we addressed behavioral issues. It's interesting. Like I've had a lot of educators listen to a talk that I've given or whatever, and say, oh yeah, well, you can do that at your school, but that would never fly at mine. And I would say, well, tell me more. And well, we just have too many discipline issues. And I said, well, here's what I'm guessing is we also have what you might call as discipline issues. We call them opportunities. And we meet with the stakeholders, AKA the students, and have conversations. And again, like there are so many people that are like, oh, that's just so touchy-feely. You don't need to do that. When you find out why something is happening, especially if it's a pattern, you are much more likely to be able to discontinue that pattern and reroute that behavior into something more positive if you know the underlying situation.
I was going to say, how many times did we find out that what would be seen as misbehavior was actually an unmet need? So, and that unmet need could be a lot of things. It could be a relational unmet need. It could be that they didn't have the skills that they needed in that moment to navigate the situation that they were trying to navigate. We can't change behaviors unless we understand what the unmet need is to then work with students to either build the skill, help them better navigate the relational upset, help them, whatever. And how many times in schools do the adults lose their cool? And so it's just, we're handing out a punishment rather than taking the time to understand what just happened. Because a lot of times it's just a disagreement. Like we weren't seeing the world the same way. And now it's, come to blows, or we didn't understand the rules of the game the same way. And so now we're in conflict, or I didn't know that that's how it was supposed to work because I've never been in this situation before, so I just was doing my own thing because I didn't know that when, we're sitting in a play that you shouldn't like get up and stand on your chair and sing a song in the middle, all of these things that it's like we think that kids just naturally pick up on these things. And the reality is so many of these things are skills that have been learned over time. And so we just get upset that they're not, they're not following the rule, or they're not doing this or that. Taking the time to have the conversation often showed us what is the unmet need. And sometimes they were not ready to have conversation because they were too dysregulated. Sometimes they'd come into the office, and after I got that Disney meme game, I would sit down and I just pull out the game. And if you've never seen it, it's Disney scenes. And then there's cards that are like meme cards that go along with it. So like that feeling when your printer stops working and then you find the card that best matches. But what I loved is I'd just be flipping through those cards. Well, pretty soon the kids can I see those? Yeah, sure. So you hand them, and then they'll start talking about which movies they've seen and which they haven't. And because there's emotions displayed on these cards so beautifully, then you can start to say, so tell me what happened. Which one of these cards describes how you're feeling? And so then they'll pull, 4 or 5. Well, this one, this one, this one. Okay, tell me about that. Why does that card, what meme would you put with it? Well, that feeling when somebody steals your hat and won't give it back. And you're like, yeah. That's an intense emotion that you would be feeling. Like, yeah, that'd be really frustrating. Well, I felt like my friend didn't care about me because they weren't helping me. They were laughing, and so then you could have a bigger conversation about that moment than just saying, give the hat back, everybody sit down. That doesn't teach them any of the skills they need to navigate that problem the next time it happens.
Right. And again, now you've shown the stakeholders, the children, that you are an adult that they can trust because you truly want to listen. It helps deter some future problems because now they know that someone's going to listen to me and value what I'm saying enough to take the time to listen to me. So that investment for the stakeholder right now is time. And again, in schools, a lot of times traditional models, we forego the investment of time in our little humans because we don't think we have enough of it because we've got so many other things to do.
We've got to be efficient.
Right? But punishment in the form of discipline never solves a problem. I mean, it creates more problems. And you have, in some cases, kids who don't want to learn because they don't trust you, because you just want to punish and move on, and they want to deal with an issue, right? And
again, we're talking about efficiency in the short term versus efficiency in the long term.
Right.
What we did the way that we approached it took more time, was less efficient in the moment. But when you look at the whole scope of their time at Anastasis, it was much more efficient because I wasn't daily having to then punish this kid and put in interventions and all kinds of things that still didn't work and just push the problem down the stream.
Again, it seems so simple to us, but I do know that, again, when you have a whole list of rules and you give those to the kids, you're first of all assuming that their logic and reasoning is fully functional. And even if it is, there are not many adults. There is a learning process. I know a lot of adults who don't really either have the concept of, if I do this, this is going to happen, or they have, for some reason or other, decided not to pay attention to that logic and reasoning.
Well, and again, there are cognitive processes underlying that if those are out of sync, they cannot do that logic and reasoning. Like what we're asking them to do, they literally cannot do without first building up that cognitive process.
Right. You look at an infant or a toddler, and I joke around a lot with my kids and my grandchildren about how, if you're 3 years old, telling your child not to do something because this is going to happen, that's not developmentally ready for that yet. And you can't put those things together sequentially. Sure, you told her not to do it, but she still did it. Okay, well, now what's the consequence? Okay, is it a punishment? That doesn't make any sense. How are you going to help this child learn to be logical when that's not a developmental skill that she has yet? When we look at students in school, again, we can look at maybe a 12, 13, 17-year-old kid and say, well, they should have pretty fully developed logic and reasoning. They have developed logic.
That would be nice.
I mean, but they have fundamental logic and reasoning sometimes.
Sure.
Like if I touch that hot stove, I'm going to burn my hand. That's one piece.
Yes.
If I don't finish my homework, I'm going to get a bad grade. That is there, but now you're also forgetting that there is something else that might be more attractive to I'm not finishing my homework, and the grade is not enough for me to care about that thing.
Or there's something out of my control that is taking that time.
Exactly.
Watching a sibling, and I am more afraid of my parent being upset that I wasn't paying attention to my sibling than the school being upset that I didn't turn in homework.
So now we're not investing our time in understanding our stakeholders and what their values are. And again, we can hope that kids value an education, but in the grand scheme of things, especially when you're looking at tweens and teenagers, their social needs tend to be more highly prioritized than schoolwork. Okay, I can still use that as a teacher if I have the freedom to be able to address the needs of each of my kids. If the curriculum is king and I don't have a choice, then I'm now ignoring the needs of my students to make sure that I do what within the constraints that I'm under. So again, we keep going back to who really is this for? Is it the student? Or I even think about like the school districts that are high performing and they have very high test scores and they talk about that all the time. And I'm like, are your kids learning, or are you so focused on those test scores because it looks good to your stakeholders that you're ignoring the stakeholders in your classrooms?
Have you optimized test takers? Because when I hear that, that's what I hear. I hear we have optimized test takers, and we've been in schools that have optimized test takers and watched them interact with our kids on a playground. And it is night and day different the way that those humans interact. And I would pick ours 9 times out of 10 probably 10 times out of 10, honestly, for anything, because they're able to think more holistically about all of the things. And no, they may not pass that test with the same score as the other kid, but what they can do in the world is much more impressive and necessary and interesting than anything that the good test taker is doing.
Well, and I think even if you look back over the last few decades, what kids are graduating high school with, the skills that they're graduating with, with their grades and with their standardized tests, yes, some of them will go on to be successful. But what we're seeing at the post-secondary level is much higher academic anxiety, much more, I don't know what to do with myself. I'm not sure what I want to do. They have a little bit of an identity crisis because they've only known themselves to be a K through 12 student. Again, I know I've brought this up before, but we say, I have been in an environment where I've been told what I can do and what I cannot do for every hour of my school day for the last 13 years. And now I'm given freedom, and I've never had this before. It's either completely overwhelming for some or a complete, like almost anarchy in the brain for others where they flounder.
Well, and even that term of some get through it and are successful, even that statement, right? Because how are we defining success usually is, are they contributing to the GDP and high earners, right? Is really, at the end of the day, how we tend to frame success in this country. I don't even know that all of those folks would say that they've got complete success. And the reason I say that is look at how many self-help books are on the market. Look at how much we spend on, self-care and all of these things, which tell me that we're not really holistically successful. We're successful in one metric. And that was the metric we happened to push forward in school. So to me, just because I'm a high earner, which wouldn't that be nice? But just because I'm a high earner does not mean that I'm successful. If I don't know how to have a healthy relationship, I'm miserable because I don't know how to create balance in my life. I don't have real friends because everybody's just an acquaintance I've met through work, and they only add value to my life as they add, dollars or networking or whatever. I don't know that we can truly call it success when it's so narrowly defined. And so it's like, even then, again, I would rather have the whole person who has had the experience like an Anastasis student. I know we're not the only ones doing this work or who have done this work, but looking at the student as the stakeholder, seeing them as whole people, addressing them as whole people and their learning as whole people, and not just focused in one area.
That they know that they have multiple interests outside of their vocation or their career path.
And they're valuable in more ways than just what they know. I mean, you and I struggle with that as adults of like, well, I'm only valuable if I'm productive and if I know the right things. And how much have you and I had to undo those messages?
A
with
lot.
And for each other, right?
It's interesting too, because I think the flip side of that is, okay, we have people who would self-identify as successful. And we have schools who will have, given them the stamps to say, yes, these are successful. These are successful human beings. What about the rest? Why do we why do we find it acceptable that there are some who, oh, sorry, you didn't try hard enough, or yeah, you're just not a scholar, or those kind of things. And
or your family didn't have enough to send you to that school or that university, or, you didn't have the opportunities that led you to that place that we can deem you as successful because it's Ivy League or, whatever that might look like.
And we look at that, and again, it's that whole sorting and ranking that starts in schools and then continues on into life.
Well, and part of that is because think about how back to stakeholders, back to like, we look at what the product is and we say, well, that product is more valuable than something else. And we do that through what we're willing to pay people and how, but you consider the people that make our days possible. You consider that we need somebody who is going to collect waste and do something with it. And it's going to be really, really obvious when that stops happening. That is a high value individual in my life who takes my waste and takes it somewhere else. It is a high value individual when my heat is not working that can come and make that work again. It is a high value individual that stocks the grocery shelves so that I can go and get produce for whatever I'm going to make tonight, right? I think we think in terms, unfortunately, in our country, so much as that means somebody who makes enough money, whatever we've deemed is enough money. And that's the person who we're going to say is the high value because, and you will justify it. They're creating all these jobs for people and we'll justify it in all kinds of ways that's why they're more valuable than, somebody else. And yet our society does not run well without all of us doing the things and all of us doing it together. And it becomes really obvious in LA fires. Like, you may not think that an organization is high value until you need that organization because your house burned down. You may not think, there's all these things that we take for granted until the world shuts down because of a pandemic. And suddenly the things we thought were the most important, as it turns out, weren't as important as we thought. And so it's like,
I think
all of that
COVID definitely showed whose lives were valued and whose were, this is an expectation, you better be there because I need it. And again, I'm like, okay, I hear you. Those grocery stores need to keep running because people need to eat. However, we also want to ensure that the people who are working in the grocery stores are safe and that their health isn't compromised by this thing that we don't know how it's happening. Right. It was really an interesting study in humanity for some of us. And I say interesting with air quotes for sure. But again, when you go back and you start to think, okay, how do I show each and every human being I interact with, and even the ones I don't have a face-to-face interaction with, how do I live my life in a way that shows that I value other people? And that can be obviously a financial investment, but the one thing that I know that I can give people in the here and now is my time and my attention. If I take stakeholders back to the students in our schools, our stakeholders, then
I would say primary stakeholders,
yes,
right?
Yes.
We have lots of secondary, but the primary stakeholder is the student.
How do I invest? Of course, I want to have a financial investment that there's budget and there's funding, obviously. But the thing that I know that I can give them is my time and my attention to what they value. So it's this connection where we're sharing particles. We're never going to get away from quantum physics ever again, are we?
I know. Nope.
But I can give them my time and my attention. I can listen. I can show them that I value them by how I interact with them, how I treat them, how I tell them I expect them to treat me. All of these things that we do that sometimes are wrapped up in that social emotional learning umbrella, as well as, hey guys, I really love music or I really love math, and look at where we can find all of these things together. And now I'm going to help you explore this path together. Now, my job as the adult is also to make sure, are they able to read? Are they able to understand how their math facts contribute to their understanding of more advanced math? All of those things.
I was going to say, it's not throwing out any expectations or any certain expectations. It's not throwing out expectations that we have for kids. We have the expectation of growth in lots of areas, right? The way that growth looks, the way that we decided that growth looks at Anastasis is not as time bound as it is in most schools. And when we think about time as more of a relationship between what is happening physically around us, rather than it's this linear thing that has to look, very regimented and segmented, that relationship changes. That space that we give the learning to happen changes. And suddenly we're able to do more somehow than if we had done it on a timetable. Right. And a lot of that is just because we're looking for those opportunities of like, oh, we're not doing SEL here, and we're not doing science over here, and we're not doing math over here. We're doing life and learning and all of it, which doesn't look as efficient on paper, doesn't look as efficient on the linear timeline or the structured timeline. But when we have a different orientation to time and to learning, as it turns out in the long view, it's much more efficient. It's much more rich. All of the depth is there, but that's hard to capture for external stakeholders, not student stakeholders, external stakeholders who are looking for prove to me that they are reading, prove to me that they know this math, prove to me that they are going to be contributing citizens, prove to me that they're going to be high value individuals someday, right? Like all of that is, again, we talk a lot about this, but we start in education in the wrong place so often with the wrong questions and in the wrong place.
Before we hit record, you were talking about time and again, you and I have been learning about how time isn't what we really conceive it to be. We only experience it in linear fashion, or we think that we do because of how we record it now. And you were talking about how time was during more agrarian times. You want to speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, I was reading Oliver Berkman's book, 4,000 Weeks, and it's great. If you've not read it, it's worth a read. But essentially, he was talking about how we think about time in terms of like 30-minute chunks on a calendar, right? On our Google Calendar. And how are we going to utilize that time? And how are we going to make it the most efficient it can be? And when are we going to wake up? And when are we going to do this and this? Well, before we had calendars to tell us exactly what that looked like, we were following the natural rhythms around us. So we would get up and milk the cows because the cows were ready to be milked. We would feed the chickens because the chickens were hungry. Like, it was more following the natural rhythms around us. And that's really the connection I had in my brain, was that's what we're wanting in learning. We're wanting to follow the natural rhythms around us, being the students, rather than trying to say, well, we're going to get up at 5 a.m. and we've got 15 minutes to milk the cow. And oh, by the way, if we look at that in terms of efficiency now, it'd be like, we got to get up at 5 a.m. We're going to milk the cow, but we're going to milk them for 3 hours so that we've got a store for the rest of the week and we don't have to. And it's like, well, no, of course we wouldn't do that. That's not how it works. But when we organize our time, that's really what we're trying to do. When we try to organize learning the way we do, it's like trying to milk the cow for 3 hours so that it's like we've got that stockpile. And it's like, that's not the natural rhythm of how any of it works. And I think we've forgotten the natural rhythms, one, of humans, and two, of how learning actually happens.
I think about like the field analogy all the time, how if you are farming a field and you decide, I'm going to put corn in this field, and then you sow the corn and you have this great crop. And so the next season, you want to hurry it up so you can get more, and you
dump Miracle Grow on it.
Or you do something that's maybe unnatural and it might yield bigger this time, but the next time you've actually burnt out the field and it needs to lie fallow for a while.
Yes, and you've depleted all the nutrients in the soil because you didn't layer and the permaculture piece.
Or you didn't alternate crops, which is, I grew up in Nebraska. I've learned a lot from farmers about that. But all of that to say, when we don't honor the natural rhythms of learning with children, we ask them to get up too early sometimes. We want them to be on our timetable instead of theirs. In other words, nope, you can't go to the bathroom right now because you have to ignore your human physical needs because we're doing something different.
Because I'm in the middle of explaining math.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, all of these different things that we can think about, we do that are unnatural because we're trying to fit kids into a schedule. And I just always come back to other teachers and parents asking me, okay, so I see what you're doing. How can you guarantee he's going to be reading by the end of the school year? And I'm like, I can't guarantee that because I'm not, Ratatouille up in that kid's brain, right? Mm-hmm. It's on his timetable.
And by the way, nor can any school guarantee that, or any teacher. And if they're telling you they can,
they're lying.
It's a bunch of baloney because there's no way we can know that.
Yeah, I could have forced those kids to do all of the things that the so-called science of reading tells me to do to ensure that they'll read. What my personal goals were is I want them to love books. I want them to get excited about reading. Yes, I'm going to do the things that I know scientifically help them learn to read, but I'm not going to push it, nor am I going to say, you must all do this today by the end of this day and have this done.
In the same way, in the same time.
I looked at each individual child and said, okay, this is what's going to work with this kid. This one, if I push too hard, I'm going to turn him completely off from reading. I'm not doing that.
And we'll never get it back.
Exactly.
Yep.
Give them the space, show them that you value, and use that word yet a lot. Mm-hmm. Just allowing kids to feel empowered in their own learning just goes miles compared to, well, sorry, you have to do this because we're at the end of unit 7 and we take a test now. I don't care if you're ready. You should be ready. Why aren't you ready?
Well, and the proof that this doesn't work, I think we are under an illusion in this country that the way that we're doing it is the right way. And I say it's an illusion because it clearly isn't. When we have how many kids graduating who, one, will never pick up a book again, or two, are reading well below grade level. And like we said at the beginning, they've had remediation along the way. It is an illusion that that is what makes it better. And yet we keep doing the same thing because sometimes we measure it and it looks like it worked in this study, right? Or this curriculum company hired this researcher to come in and do the study, and we were magically able to prove that it worked in this scenario when we did it for this amount of time. And so it's almost like we keep passing along these practices, trying to convince ourselves that they work and ignoring the actual data that's telling us it's not working.
Right. There are 2 states that are currently suing a curriculum company. I'm not going to mention any names because I don't want to get involved in any of that. But there's 2 different states, the school districts and the company are being sued. And it was a specific method of teaching reading that some of the schools followed with fidelity and another school used it as their only curriculum. And now when students aren't reading, they're suing the curriculum company and the school districts. And I'm thinking, okay, first of all, we have put our faith into curriculum companies when that should be a resource, not this is all we teach you, right? So there is some culpability on the parts of
if that goes through, every curriculum company's hosed.
I can understand, and for some reason, it's math and reading are the two that we're always going back and trying to find better curriculum and better ways of teaching. And you have the science versus the arts of how you teach it, and people on both sides trying to like knuckle fight each other because they're right and you're wrong. And I'm just like, again, you're arguing over a method or a curriculum, and every little individual who comes into your classroom is completely different and has different needs. They might look the same in some ways.
And has different things going on at home, has different history, like all of it matters.
Right.
Had different breakfasts this morning.
Yeah.
One of them had Lucky Charms and one of them had eggs and bacon and fruit, right? It's like, I don't know. We're dealing with such a different...
They're the variables that are coming to you with each student are going to be overwhelming if you're going to try to make them fit into every single, again, we use all these metaphors, square peg, round hole, all of that to say, if you take a step back and you get to know the students and you get to know what they value and you learn where they're coming from and you know them well enough to say, oh, this kid's having a really bad day today. Any kind of testing that I do is going to tank. Or this kid does really well on tests, but truly does not understand, even though they score high on tests. So if you know the kids,
again, that was me.
If you know your students well enough, then you are going to be able to react if, again, you're given autonomy and agency to do that, to react to the different needs of those kids and be able to address them in the best way that you can. And no curriculum is ever going to do that. Do not plan your lessons a year in advance before you even have students in front of you. Don't look at a chapter in a textbook and think that every direction in that textbook is going to be able to teach each kid what to do.
And this is kind of a big bunny trail, but I think about how many teachers follow those lessons to a T and then assume there's something wrong with them when it's not working, quote unquote working, and how many teachers feel like they're failing because my district says that this is what should work, or my principal says, or this works in another classroom and all the research is there to support it, but it's not working in mine, so it must be me. And I think about how many teachers take on the burden of the system being broken, but they take it on as their own failure and fault, and how many teachers we lose in education because that's the message that is not explicitly given, but implicitly, I would say, is there, or easy to draw that conclusion, especially when you've been told that this is the magic bullet that's going to change everything.
Well, and again, depending upon the state and the district or the school, sometimes teachers don't have the flexibility to teach it in a way that meets the needs of the kids because they are expected to teach with fidelity or through a pacing guide or through a script. And again, for those folks, we have so much empathy and sympathy because we know that's not what kids need. And it's supposed to be a fail safe, But again, that kind of thing works like if I'm making a product and I need to make sure every single product is uniform. Children are not uniform. They never will
they're
be.
not products.
And we don't want them to be.
And no, and this I think is exactly the scenario you just set up. We want to make sure that we're teaching with fidelity, and so it's scripted and it's all of this. I think part of that is what opens the door to, well, technology will do it better because it will be consistent all the time and it will meet their needs exactly where they are and all of these things. You're just accelerating the problem.
Right.
You've just made it easier for the problem to exist. You've not actually solved anything because we already know that doesn't work because it's not working. It's currently not working. Doing it faster is not going to make it better. And what we know is when you take time to see students, when you take time to know who that stakeholder is and who and you're showing up and you're seeing them as whole people, everything else changes and becomes easier. In some ways, right? I say easier. You know what I mean by that.
Right.
Others probably don't know what I mean by that. But we're so sold because of, again, back to business and how business works in this country and that everything should work like that or everything does work like that. We're so sold that narrative that we keep trying to do it within education. And then we're surprised when it doesn't work. And I think if we saw it more as the natural ecosystem and approached it more that way, we'd be surprised at what came out of it, which is essentially what we did at Anastasis. Is we're treating it as this natural ecosystem. And we're like, oh yeah, the ecosystem, not efficient in the way that we would make it efficient, and yet healthier all the way around because of the way it interacts.
It just keeps reminding me that it's so relational. And I know that might be a hard thing, that there are some people who have had experiences in schools where they don't trust the adults to treat their children fairly, provide them with an adequate and with an appropriate education. And so I can see from that perspective too, everything that we're saying, here's how you should do it, that only works if you have people with integrity who truly believe that they can move your students forward. If it's just lip service and I'm not really going to do what I say I do and I'm going to let your kids do whatever they want, then and there have been situations documented where that's happened. And I know that families are nervous about that.
And we agree that is bad.
Yes.
We also don't want that. Right.
No.
But back to if that's happening, it's already happening.
Right.
And so it's like, that shouldn't be a reason to preserve the system as is, because if it's happening, it's already happening. What that tells me is we need to get better at training and hiring
for sure
teachers.
And again, that goes back to time and financial investment, right? So when you're looking at now, when we step back from the students being the primary stakeholder, now we're looking at the other stakeholders, including taxpayers, including community members, who are saying, okay, well, if we put this much money into our schools, we want to make sure it's working. And I'm like, I agree.
Well, they're looking for return on investment. Yes. And again, that ROI that they look at is looking at one tiny sliver of the story. And even the tiny sliver it's looking at is the timeline's too short. It's not well connected to everything else. And so it's not even when they feel good about the return on investment because kids are passing tests, that's not we shouldn't be
right.
We shouldn't be okay with it. Like It's not enough.
It's how do you please, millions of individuals who all have their own experience of what school was like? How do you address the needs of every single different human being? It's a huge endeavor to say, we're going to offer a free and appropriate education for every student in our country. A lot of countries don't do that. I wish that they did, but now, if we look at it from that viewpoint, how do we do this in a way that is, yes, cost efficient, but that has to be lowered down on the list of priorities, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to just throw money at a problem of education and then think that's going to make it go away. But there are a lot of questions.
I think is interesting and tangential to this conversation is How many of us are, when we think about school in the United States as a whole, you'll often hear it's a failing system, it's not doing enough, it's, it needs change. We hear all of that narrative. What is upsetting to me is within your own community, unless you have children in the school in that community, you probably don't know what's happening in that school. In other words, you have no idea how they're teaching. You don't know what opportunities those kids have. You don't know if the school is feeding them or not. You don't there are things you just don't know because you're not tied into that school enough. And so there's this disconnect in communities with even what's happening in schools. Again, unless you've got a kid in there or a teacher or you've got somebody in the building, you probably don't know what's going on in there. And then you add the added layer of the people who do have kids in that school, in most of these schools, and you ask them, well, what's your experience? What was your school experience? So many of them are like, yeah, I know it's broken, but it worked for me. Mm-hmm. Or I know it's broken, but my kids have had a pretty good experience in school.
We love our school, but we know other schools aren't great.
Other schools aren't great. And the problem with that is, one, if you think that everybody else's school is broken, but yours isn't, you're not understanding that all of them are doing essentially the same things. So if you think it's broken on a large scale, but you don't think it's broken on your small scale, what that probably means is your kids were relatively happy going through school. They got something out of it. They seem to be learning. They seem to be progressing. They had friends, those kind of things, right? If they're relatively happy, we'll call that successful. What you and I know is we're not asking enough of that scenario because
layers of issues.
They're successful in the way I was successful, in that they're probably passing tests. They're relatively get through school unscathed. I wouldn't call that a successful education, knowing what I know about what it can be. And I think part of the problem is just that disconnect between what is happening in people's communities and what they know about how schools are running, what schools are doing, how they're operating, and then the national narrative of what's happening in schools.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think that the marketing and the messaging is what's skewed more so. Are there things in education I would love to change? If I had a magic wand and said I get to make the decision, absolutely I would. I would say, let's really start with the kids. Let's go from there. However, if we take a step back and say on a national level, are our schools really failing? And then I would say, well, failing what? Because you're not asking the question. It's a lot. And it goes back to our source of news is often more about the scandals, and they want the salacious stories, and you don't hear the good stories.
Those get more clicks.
Right. When I see school, even if I just drive around town, I can see kids on different trips. I see a bunch of young people out helping at a local museum, and they're there helping visitors to learn about the museum. It was a school project. There are really good things happening in a lot of schools, and those things don't make the news.
And I was going to say, you and I are lucky because we're connected with enough incredible educators and people like pushing the boundaries and these really innovative micro schools and these interesting things that folks are doing. And Anastasis was in the news maybe twice, I think we have a stepping stone story and one other, but the whole thing is we're not amplifying enough of what really could be working well. And we're so focused on what's not.
It really does make me think too. I have to focus a whole lot more on making sure that I share the good. So we did that a lot with within our school. We didn't have a Friday folder, but our weekly newsletters were pictures and little narration about here's what we did this week, so that parents didn't. At first, they were like, oh, I'm not seeing any work coming home, and they're not doing homework at our school, so I don't know if they're learning. And so we evolved to share photo stories and small narratives, sometimes long narratives, about what the kids were doing. And, that was something that I've spent usually on average about 2 hours on each of those newsletters every week. And that was a lot of time, but I also looked at it as I'm investing this time because it really helps parents to see, oh, It also helps the kids because they got to have conversations at home about some of the things that they were doing that they didn't.
And honestly, I think it helped all of us because all the teachers got each other's. And then it was this like, I saw that you're doing this in class. Let's connect on this. Or it became like a neat window between classes and sharing ideas and sharing, collaborating, not in real time, like asynchronously through those newsletters.
All of that to say, those kind of things are the way that you help people to see what's happening in your school. If I go to your school website and it's, a bunch of text and maybe some stock photos of kids, I mean, I get how I don't personally think that we should have a bunch of actual student photos on a website. However, you can take photos of activities without showing identifying photos of kids. And we did that up quite a bit at Anastasis as well. To share the good of what's happening, because it helps to reshape and to take back the narrative of, these kids these days. And the same things that you hear.
And to explain and to help people see learning more multidimensionally than just the one data point that they get, from the standardized test, or the data point that shows up in the news story about, we're 43rd in math in the world, or whatever that is. I think to better tell those stories of what learning actually looks like, because then too, the other stakeholders, the non-student stakeholders, can make better decisions because they're more informed about what multidimensional whole child learning looks like. And they can say, no, we're not going to be okay with the short-term ROI of a standardized test score that's not telling enough of that story, and told me that my child was behind in this moment in time, when over a 4-year period, I see that they've learned so much, there's been so much growth, and there's nowhere that's telling that story or sharing that story or demonstrating that that's true. So I think the more that we can kind of push that out, those of us who are seeing things this way, the better that the narrative in the communities get, the better that other stakeholders can make decisions on behalf of kids.
And having kids doing the reporting, I mean, every kid is like, oh, I get to be the reporter today. That's, again, taking it back to, we're seeing things through their eyes and how they're processing what's been going on and the learning. It's beneficial for them academically to do so, but also most adults don't want to hear from the adults in a school. But you say, hey, do you want to hear, Johnny has a story that he would like to share? Of course they want to hear that.
Well, and I don't know if you remember, Colin Reynolds did Kid Cam and would literally have a GoPro, like put a kid in charge. And Kid Cam showed him, how are the kids experiencing my classroom? And he's like, it's amazing. He's really tall, but he's like, it's amazing. In a kindergarten classroom, like you see when they're looking up and experiencing things, like how that feels from their perspective when the camera is just, on their hat. But two, the stories that you can start to tell families through those moments where they're actually seeing how that learning and how the deconstructing and conversations and discussion and all of that. We've got some families this year, some Anastasis families that are homeschooling, and our Dean of Students is doing a homeschool enrichment. And I get videos every now and then of the things that they're doing, but it's incredible because she'll send the video of what they made instead of just a static picture. And then you hear her dialoguing with the students, just like we did all the time at Anastasis. But what stands out to me is now parents are getting the same view that I got as the educator in that processing, what kinds of questions I'm asking, how they're thinking about it, what pieces they're putting together. That if I just even sent home a report card with some comments and an A grade and that project, you're never going to see all of the ways that they were connecting, the problems they solved along the way, how they were thinking about their role, what part, at one point she said, and what part, do you remember what part we got really frustrated with and hung up? Oh yeah. And then it's this whole, and so all of that is so valuable. And I wish we had done more of that piece. It just, I don't know why it didn't occur to me, at least. I know you guys did more of that where you send parents little snippets of videos, but as a practice, like that would have been an incredible newsletter,
right?
To send that video home of seeing how that thinking is going and maybe doing it through a different student's eyes each time. Because I think that too tells, it's so easy for us to see, and then we're baffled when other people don't see like how much better this is than everything else. But it's in those moments. It's because we're getting to see all of that in real time and parents are getting the condensed version of it. But I think if we could do a better job of that window into the classroom where they're seeing the thinking that's happening and what it took to get to that end product, that's hard to deny that that's so much richer than the Friday folder with all the graded papers with red on the top at the end of the week.
Well, in listening to like, that's why I used blogs with kids so much, or I'd have them, back when we were using Twitter, I would have different kids come up and I was the one typing it in.
Yes.
They didn't have their own Twitter account. But okay, tell me one thing you want to share with the people, with your audience, or for the older kids who were blogging, they could share photos and then they could write about their thoughts of what we were doing. And again, multiple modes of learning, multiple nodes of learning in both ways, right? But I was able to then to not only capture some of what we were doing in the classroom, but then also to see their thoughts after the fact as well. And sometimes I would go back and remind them, oh yeah, you said this was really easy, but remember that one part? Write about the struggle. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. So all of those are great learning tools. And it makes me think, again, there are times when we can use tools, whether they're journals or technology tools like blogs, where kids have time to stop and think and share their thinking in a way that's like, we've talked a lot about like visible thinking, right? How do we show the thinking process? And lots of teachers are able to do this. It's not just an Anastasis thing. I see evidence of this in schools that I visit.
Yep.
It makes me wonder though, I'm going to, I'll take it back to AI because this is kind of my pet peeve right now. But there is someone who's trying to start a school in Pennsylvania. This person who wants to start it is not from Pennsylvania, but she wants to start a 100% AI taught school for kids. And I'm like, okay, first of all, why are you going to a different state?
A place that she doesn't live in?
No. She does not live. She lives in a completely different part of the country. And she wants it to be fully AI. And I'm like, okay, besides the fact that we've already discussed AI to some degree about tutors and how incredibly not only unethical that is, but whose kids get to see a live human being and whose kids don't, right? Where do you show the thinking behind all of the learning, that the rich learning experiences that happen on a day-to-day basis with other human beings? You cannot do that with an AI tutor / teacher.
And learning is a social construct. It always has been. So I'm like, it's not that you can't learn something new or have an interesting interaction with AI. I don't believe that because I've experienced differently. And I think that kids have to be with other kids in society
and adults
in community,
right? Yes.
And adults in community interacting for the health of the world.
Right.
Because I don't believe it's going to be better. And essentially what you're saying is the purpose of learning is reduced to how many facts you know, because that's what AI is doing. It's a fact transfer. And so I think in that instance, it's even like, okay, well, then we have to define what is the purpose of education. And I think, unfortunately, because we've seen it as a product, because we've looked at it from the standpoint, again, as a business of stakeholders, that product is most easily measured by how many facts did you memorize? I don't believe that's the purpose of education. And I don't believe that that's actually what the world needs the purpose of education to be, because we need so much more robustness in what we're looking for out of education. We need people who, again, take it back, are aware of what's happening to others, are compassionate, are paying enough attention to what's happening outside of a screen to notice, like, LA is on fire. I wonder why that happens. We need people who are paying attention to the vast number of global issues and who care enough to do something about that and who have enough, again, multidisciplinary understanding of how all things are connected, that not only are they looking to solve the problems, but they're also considering what unintended consequences might come along with this.
What are the side effects from this
Yes.
prescriptive thing that we're going to put in front of kids? What are the unintended side effects that are going to get back to what Yang Zhao was saying? There were a lot of, and those side effects from a lot of things that we talked about earlier in the podcast today were bad. They were harmful. What kind of harm did we do by implementing No Child Left Behind? There was a lot, and they fell along lines of class and lines of race. And I mean, all of these different things that we're like, oh yeah. So now we go back again to, if you're considering stakeholders and you're considering where you can save money in a budget, whether that's federally, on the state level, on a local level, and you want to trim budgets from education for children by putting them in with a quote unquote robot, which we know that's not true. But if you think that there's some tech panacea that's going to be able to solve that problem, you are taking away the time and the attention from human time and human attention from other human beings. And that's just not acceptable.
Well, I don't think it makes a healthy society. It's going to create people who feel more isolated. It's going to create people who feel more disenfranchised with the systems around them. It's going to create people who can't think in multiple modalities about the problems of the world because we're siloing it further. And so it's like, I think it's a worthwhile starting point of what is the purpose of education, because I think defining that maybe changes, at least we have something consistent to measure these different initiatives that pop up and say, well, does that meet this need? And we can have a better conversation rather than walking into these static classrooms that are kind of still stuck in what they've always done and then saying, oh, well, we're going to optimize this. We're going to make this more efficient with AI, or we're going to, do this thing with, we're not starting in the right place with the right stakeholder, number one, but we're also not asking the right question of what is the purpose of education, so that when we're looking at data, when we're measuring the things we're measuring, we're actually measuring the right thing.
It reminds me of Office Space when they have the two efficiency experts come in and interview everybody. It's such a funny comical scheme. But again, I think I said earlier, when you have people who have this entrepreneurial spirit and they've decided that they know best, that they can make a decision for kids they don't even know, let alone are even in the same state, that tells me that there's some, not necessarily what's in the best interest of the kids. This is, how can I make some money off of this? And
what's really unfortunate about that, they probably will show the metrics that they're trying to show,
right?
And they'll be able to say, look at how successful it was. It worked. Not because we're looking at the right metrics, but because it's proving a metric.
If I decide what the metric is going to be, and then I tout my ability to...
Makes it a little bit easier to prove, right?
Look, I did it. Look at how great my metrics are.
I did it.
But I defined the metric.
I did it.
Yeah.
It's like the kid on the playground who's like, let's play this game and I'm going to make up all the rules. And now the rule changed this way because it benefits the thing I'm looking at. That's very much how it feels. Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably a good end point, don't you?
Yes, we went in kind of all kinds of directions. Hopefully people stuck with us. The through line was enough of a through line for it to make sense. But as it works for our brains, everything is always connected. And so it's like, yes, the SEL matters to the stakeholder, matters to this, all these things are kind of interconnected. So.
I think next time we could really talk more about, I know we gave some examples of how we did social emotional learning at Anastasis, but I think maybe in our next episode, we could break down how we start from scratch every school year. And the pieces that we put into place to make sure that it was part of the way that we did school.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I am curious what would happen on like a blue sky or something if we just threw out the question, like from your perspective, what is the purpose of education, and see the varied answer. I'd just be curious to see what answers come and from a variety of folks.
Yeah.
And asking the question, who's the stakeholder? I wonder the varied answers we'd get there.
Let's do that.
Because we had a pretty small group and it was pretty varied, even in that small group of who the stakeholders are. So anyway.
Try it out.
Onward. Always more to do. Always more to do.
Always.
Onward. Hey, Michelle, where else can people find you online?
I blog at avenue4learning.com, and the 4 is the actual number 4, not the word 4, avenue4learning.com.
And you can find me at dreamsofeducation.wordpress.com, which is my original blog. You can also find me at ktsplace.com, which is where I share a bunch of resources and kind of projects that we're currently working on. And we are both on Blue Sky at the moment, but not as active as we once were on our favorite bird. Come find us and connect with us in other places, and we look forward to connecting with you.
Education.